On Monday, Joe Biden took the podium to recognize the FDA's full approval for the Pfizer vaccine, but more enthusiastically to recognize what that full approval means. He says it's a justification for states and localities and private businesses to issue vaccine mandates. And he's not just acknowledging their power to do it, he's urging them to do it.
Today I'm calling on more companies, I should say, in the private sector to step up with vaccine requirements. If you're a business leader, a nonprofit leader, a state or local leader who has been waiting for full FDA approval to require vaccinations, I call on you now to do that, require it.
And that urge for others to do his bidding for him is a tacit admission that he doesn't have the legal authority to do this himself, and so he's playing that old, if private business does it for me, it doesn't count as unconstitutional card, much like he did and is doing with social media censorship. Either that or he just doesn't have the political balls to try a federal mandate and test the pushback, but then again, he is no stranger to political suicide lately. If there's one thing falling faster than a Kabul skydiver, it is Joe Biden's polling numbers, so who knows? But whatever his reasons, Joe is relying on his powerful friends to bully you so that he can deny the bullying himself, and we will undoubtedly see plenty of them line right up upon their orders. But only some of these thugs wait for their direction to start the process. Others are thugs on their own behalf and got started early, namely New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, who tried to tempt you with an injection as a ticket to gorge on fast food, all for the sake of health, of course.
I want you to look at this and think about, again, some people love hamburgers, some don't, really want to respect all ways of life. But if this is appealing to you, just think of this when you think of vaccination. Vaccination. I'm getting a very good feeling about vaccination right this moment.
As offensive as those chewing sounds may be, the most offensive part of that display is the outright lie. We want to respect all ways of life, except, of course, for the ways of life of those who prefer not to be vaccinated. We don't respect them at all. For them, their way of life is over.
We've got to shake people at this point and say, come on now. We tried voluntary. The voluntary phase is over. Voluntary alone doesn't work.
And thus, Bill became the first mayor in the country to issue a citywide vaccine mandate, at least for certain segments of business. If you run a restaurant or a gym or a theater, de Blasio will force the vaccine on you. And you will force the vaccine on your employees and patrons.
If you're vaccinated, all that's going to open up to you. You'll have the key, you can open the door. But if you're unvaccinated, unfortunately, you will not be able to participate in many things. That's the point we're trying to get across. It's time for people to see vaccination as literally necessary to living a good and full and healthy life.
And no matter your view on these vaccines, that is a statement that anybody with any semblance of appreciation for freedom and liberty should oppose. Who decides what a good and healthy and full life is? Is that for you to decide for yourself as the owner and author of your own life? Or is that for some superior dictator to decide for you? Because once you grant them that power, it does not end with vaccines and other stuff you like. That logic extends to every aspect of your life. Your diet, or lack thereof, should be subject to government oversight and direction because it's necessary for a good and full and healthy life. Your exercise routine, or lack thereof, should be subject to government oversight and direction because it's necessary for a good and full and healthy life. Your vices, maybe you like to drink or smoke or gamble. Those things should be subject to government oversight and direction because control of them is necessary for a good and full and healthy life. And if you have any second thoughts about government making those decisions and definitions, if you look at Bill de Blasio and think, I don't know, maybe I can handle my own personal affairs better than this Batman casting reject can, it is wise to stand up for that principle now. Because even if you like the things that he's forcing you to do today, if there's one thing more foolish than trading your personal autonomy for a burger, it's trusting a guy like that to make the right decision for you every single time. But since Bill was the first in the nation bully, that means there will also be first in the nation pushback. And that's exactly what's happening now. Before the voluntary phase is truly over at the September 13th enforcement deadline, The lawsuit phase has officially begun, and the lawsuit is important to look at because just as Bill is giving politicians elsewhere a blueprint for tyranny beta testing, this lawsuit gives everyone else a blueprint for how to challenge this stuff in court. Because a lot of this is somewhat uncharted legal territory. We haven't tried a lot of this stuff under the modern legal framework, and so the arguments presented are worth following and understanding. Now, don't get me wrong. Bill de Blasio is a complete dipshit remains the most compelling argument outside of court. But inside the court, it'll be much more technical questions about what power is actually legal and constitutional. Last week, a group of small businesses, including mostly restaurants and gyms, filed a lawsuit in Richmond County State Court against the mayor and the city, alleging several issues of unconstitutionality in the mayor's vaccine mandate. The lawsuit has the open support of several Republican officials, including a congresswoman and a city councilman. The business owner's case is somewhat of a shotgun blast of arguments, and I get that. When you're faced with a shotgun blast of tyranny, a shotgun blast of a court challenge in response is understandable. It's a product of both the depth of the government's overreach and it's a legal strategy. When you're faced with somewhat of a new government action without a lot of precedent, you throw what you can and you see what sticks. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, factually or strategically. It just means that I find some of the arguments a lot more compelling and satisfying than others. The first argument made is that this vaccine mandate is arbitrary and capricious, in that it applies only to certain types of businesses and not others, supposedly on the basis that restaurants, gyms, and theaters are places where groups of unassociated people interact for substantial periods of time, as though that same reasoning doesn't just as validly apply to grocery stores, salons, or office buildings, none of which are facing the same vaccine mandate. The suit also makes a similar argument that the mandate makes no exception for people who can't get the vaccine for medical reasons or for people with natural immunity from prior infection. And those things are perfectly true. This mandate is not universal in its application, and there are no exceptions for those to whom it does apply. But the reason I'm not very satisfied with these arguments is not because I think that they're wrong. It's because they only attack around the edges, thus pretending or implying that they'd be satisfied if these conditions were met. Sure, the city is not applying this rule evenly. And sure, the city did not make medically necessary exceptions. But what if they did? What if the city did apply this mandate to all businesses instead of just some? What if the city did make a medical exception or two? Would this lawsuit be okay with the mandate then? In other words, is this lawsuit fine with vaccine mandates generally, just not this particular vaccine mandate? Or is this lawsuit against vaccine mandates overall? It's against vaccine mandates overall, and we know this because of the suit's subsequent reasoning, which renders that first argument factually fine, but effectively irrelevant. And so the real substance of the case begins when it starts attacking what the city will undoubtedly use to defend itself, the often referenced 1905 Supreme Court case of Massachusetts v. Jacobson, in which the Supreme Court upheld the state's right to mandate the smallpox vaccine under a broad deference to the state's 10th Amendment police powers. That case is commonly cited by vaccine mandate supporters as binding precedent, but as today's lawsuit notes, there are some potential problems with just deferring to Jacobson and calling it a day. While that is what the Supreme Court said over 100 years ago, that case may now be at odds with the court's constitutional theory that's developed in the century since. When Jacobson was decided, the Supreme Court was operating on the theory that the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states, and thus the states were free to handle these affairs as they saw fit. But of course, since then, the court has reasoned that through the 14th Amendment, states are bound to uphold your federal constitutional rights. That's why the states can't restrict your speech rights, or your assembly rights, or raid your house without a warrant. It's called the incorporation doctrine, as in your federal constitutional rights are incorporated into your state. And that incorporation doctrine is a gigantic debate in itself. Should the U.S. Constitution apply to your relationship with your state? Or is that judicial activism itself and a deviation from the Constitution's intended design? That's one to address with another video. For now, incorporation is the current legal standard. The U.S. Constitution applies to the states, which calls Jacobson into question then, because Jacobson said there were no constitutional rights at issue in that case because that was a state mandate. not a federal one. But that's no longer the appropriate reasoning according to the court's decisions in the century since. Now we apply the U.S. Constitution to the states. And indeed, that is exactly what the Supreme Court has done in recent coronavirus cases with other restrictions and mandates. In November, when the court ruled against the state of New York's restrictions on church attendance, the Supreme Court didn't say simply, well, that's a state issue. New York has police power, case closed, as Jacobson would prescribe. Instead, the court said there are fundamental rights at stake, namely the First Amendment rights of religious exercise and assembly. And so without a compelling state interest achieved through narrowly tailored means, according to the strict scrutiny test that applies to fundamental constitutional rights, the state of New York loses. So it's under that framework that this New York City lawsuit is asking courts to analyze the mandate. The next question in that analysis is, okay, so the U.S. Constitution's fundamental rights apply to New York City government. In that case, what are the fundamental rights infringed? The suit claims primarily two. The violation of the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the law, since, as described, this law targets some businesses but not others without a sufficiently compelling reason to do so or narrowly tailored means of achieving the state's goals, and the violation of the right to pursue a lawful calling. In other words, the right to work and earn a living, since this mandate threatens to destroy the livelihoods of thousands of New York City business owners or workers if they dare not to comply. And that right to work and to earn a living may sound like something of a stretch. It's obviously not an explicitly protected constitutional right, but it is one that state and federal courts have recognized in prior cases, and it's somewhat of a logical extension of the 5th and 14th Amendment's protection of your property rights. If your labor is your property, then you have a right to it, and absent some compelling state interest pursued through narrowly tailored means, it shouldn't be taken from you. It's not a perfect or guaranteed successful argument, but that's roughly the one that they're going with. Now, will it win in court? We'll have to wait and see. I think these legal arguments are interesting and important to keep track of, but the deeper we get into this authoritarian experiment, the more lines we thought would never be crossed are jumped with ease and enthusiasm. It is crucial to remember that the courts are merely one mechanism for the preservation of your rights. You are also endowed with the right to defend your rights yourself. And that's not according to me, internet censors. That's according to this country's founding philosophy. Politicians serve at the consent of the governed. That is the only thing that gives them any moral legitimacy. And without it, everything else, including their arguments in court, is irrelevant. So when you hear a politician say the voluntary phase is over, when you hear a politician revoke his respect for your consent, well, that just means the compliant phase is over. No respect for our rights, no respect for you. That is the deal on which our country has always been based. And what's called extremism today was the first day of American history and civics class yesterday. That's why I get a kick out of the New York Times writing, "Republicans say that the mandate is unenforceable," as though it's just a matter of partisan politics. No, it actually is unenforceable, particularly when by design you expect us to enforce it on ourselves. You expect business owners to enforce it on their employees and patrons. It would not take 100% non-compliance to kill this mandate outright. 10%, 20%, 30% non-compliance? Do you think the city has the resources to visit that volume of businesses and audit the vaccination record of every single transaction? They don't. Do you think the city has the political balls to drive out that many businesses for non-compliance at a time when New York is struggling economically, but freer places are open and recovering perfectly well? Perhaps de Blasio does think he can do that. Perhaps he's counting on Washington, D.C. to bail New York City out financially. But even if he does think that, calling his bluff makes him prove it. He's counting on your fear for enforcement, not his own knock on your door. And so withholding your fear makes him stop talking about the sword and actually pull it out and swing it. And I have doubts he's really willing to do that. Besides, if you're bound to be cut off at the knees either way, either by reducing your customer base and your pool of employees or by Bill fining you otherwise, if you make Bill take that swing at your knees, at least you keep the pride of knowing that you didn't bend the knee yourself. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.